Yeah, hello everybody to our macro course. And last week we had the general introduction of what is economics all about, and we talked in general about these positive and normative issues. And this you also have to really carefully distinguish sometimes when you are writing an exam and later on you say, well, why didn't I got their full points? Then sometimes the reason is that you have, yeah, somehow written your opinion and haven't argued rigorously. And this is what it is all about, that normative is somehow what we wish and positive is our neutral analysis of something. Okay, and then we have talked about the circular flow. So one of the main concepts in order to describe an economy, and we ended up here with the modern circular flow in the graphical representation where we have the main sectors, the household sector, enterprises, government, financial institutions, so where all these investment and savings are going through, all the money is going through, and of course then overseas, because we are not alone in the world. And yeah, now we are then coming to what is it, where are we, so to speak, condensing all together this data for the circular flow. Then we have to know how much do we consume as the private sector. All this is done in the national account system. And of course, we want to compare different economies which each other. And for this, of course, it is a good idea that we are standardizing these concepts so that we are do these calculations all in the same way. And on the European scale, we have standardized it roughly 30 years ago, especially in the European Union, that more or less we calculate in the same way the numbers, and especially also in the end the economic growth rate. And the economic growth rate is calculated via the gross domestic product, a highly criticized variable, but on the other way, in my opinion, give me a better number, then we will do it. I think this is, based on our data, maybe the best way to try to describe a whole economy just within one number. But of course, on the other hand, then you have to be careful. How can I interpret this number? What can I do not with this number? What is not within this number? And about this, we want to talk now for the next 2 or 3 appointments. So what is GDP, gross domestic product? First of all, then we have to carefully define what is understood by gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the total market value, especially market value, very important, of all goods and services produced within a country in a specific time period. So somebody know what is GDP in Germany in euros? Last year, 24. Do you have an idea? It's a little bit more than 4 billion euros. And then, of course, you have to know how do I calculate this number? And this means within the country's borders and within a specific time period. We get also data for the GDP on a quarterly basis. Then, of course, the number on a quarterly basis will be a little bit more than 1 billion. So you have always to be careful that you know what you are talking about. And what I not now anymore, but in the starting of ChatGPT 2 years ago, no, 3 years ago, then when I ask what is gross domestic product, the output sometimes missed the last important point, all goods and services used for final consumption. So that is quite a lengthy definition with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 specific aspects where we have to talk about what is meant by these 5 specific aspects. And yeah, sometimes in exams I ask what is gross domestic product, and most of the students then gave me maybe not the same definition as here, but if I do find all these 5 aspects within your own words, then of course it is okay. But if you miss one of these aspects, well, then you didn't have got 0 points from me. But on the other hand, if you miss one, then it is not the definition of gross domestic product. And as I mentioned it, if you ask AI what is gross domestic product, maybe there is missing one of these aspects. And then, of course, the output is just wrong. And there you have always to be careful using AI. Okay, but now we want to go through all these 5 aspects of gross domestic product. So what is meant by market value? We try to aggregate, think of the circular flow, all economic aspects within a country, and there we look how many cars, how many chairs have we produced, how often have we traveled, where we have paid for, and we just always take the current market prices. So if we ask for GDP in 2024, then we look how many chairs we have produced in the year 2024, and then we multiply this number of chairs with the price of chairs in the last year. So with the market price, with the current price, maybe I also put here current market prices. Well, but we want here the second one to count all goods and services. And then there are some relevant goods and services which do not have a market price in this specific period. Think maybe about very large products which are produced only every 3 years or something like this. And then they are sold, they are built now, and they will be sold in the next year. Then we have already produced it and there is no market price. And then we have to ask ourselves, how can we estimate now a price which is maybe in the neighborhood of a market price? And this, I think, you have done in your business administration courses. When you are going in a company and you start producing, then you haven't already sold your product, but you have to have an idea what could be my price with which I'm entering the market. And the first step is then that you just look at your production costs. What have I invested in producing my goods? And this will be then maybe something like a lower limit because I want to earn something by selling. And so if I do not have a market price, then I take for an estimator just the production price of this good that I say, well, this is what I now use for counting these goods. Well, and then again, going back to our large sector, the government sector within a country, especially this sector is producing many services. But of course, these services are not sold on a private market. Think, for example, if you need a new passport. This is a service provided by the government. And then you are paying some fee. I don't know, in Germany it's roughly 50 euros or something like this. But of course, a German passport is maybe the most valuable passport in the world because we can travel in every country. It is always, I think, the Singaporean passport or another country. So there are roughly 2 or 3 passports in the world where you can almost travel in every country. Of course, this passport, this service of a passport has a much higher value than this fee of 50 euros. So it does not enter GDP just with this fee of 50 euros because what is behind providing these service, this is all the administration of our state, of our country. And then we make something similar as which we have made for goods where we do not have a market price. We ask ourselves, how is this service produced by the public? Well, and then we see the main input of this service are the employees of the public sector. And therefore, then we consider for the public services entering the GDP, we have no private markets, we have no market prices. So something similar like production prices, we say the main input is the labor, are the employees of the public sector, and therefore we take the wages, the overall wages of the public sector for the estimation of the price with which the public services enter the gross domestic product. So you see, just seeing market value, it is not that easy in the end. How do I practically then compute these market value? Then, of course, I have to think about all these little words. What is behind this? Well, especially if you think, if you are living in a flat, then you are paying your rent every month. So this, of course, then directly enters market value, the GDP. But if you own your flat or your little house, then you do not pay every month. How do I then count this? Because more or less you are doing the same. You are living somewhere. And then, of course, we look at the region, and then we see that we have, so to speak, an average rent for a flat of 50 square meters or something like this. You are owning this, or 10% of the inhabitants of a town living in their own flats. Of course, these 10% have also to enter GDP, and then we multiply these owner-occupied flats just with the average flat, with the average rent of the region. And then one of the most criticized points of GDP, then we have many, many goods which actually we cannot practically count or count them in a good way. And there we really have to admit that we know that they do not enter GDP. And especially this is then the criticism when we are interpreting GDP as a welfare indicator. Because all the educational performances of parents. Well, in Germany, we are right now changing this part that we are providing all these educational in our changing our educational system that we can give our children with 1 year somewhere else. Well, there are the people are paid caring about the children. This, of course, directly enters GDP. But if the child stays at home, the same serving is done, the same service is done. But this actually really doesn't enter GDP. So some of our economic growth in Germany is just due to our change of our educational system during the last 15 years. If we compare this, for example, with France, they have this caring system for children already since World War II. Then we have to be careful to interpret not this part of economic growth, that this really have changed something in our country. And of course, in the end, all our honorary posts. If you are in a trainer in sports or something, you are doing in many, many ways something for your country which you would interpret is welfare enhancing overall. But this does not enter GDP, and then of course many goods and services are exchanged, and the financial administration doesn't know anything about it. And this is the black market. And this we can also only estimate. Well, we can say for industrial countries, or countries, the black market is maybe something 10 to 15% of GDP. All this is provided on a black market. Of course, in order just to increase then the number of 4.31 billion euros, which we have right now in Germany by 1.1, increasing this number just by 10%, then we have a very volatile number, so we leave it out. But we have to be careful that we know, okay, looking at the overall production in a country, of course, also includes the black market. And especially if you are going to developing countries to emerging countries, maybe this number is higher, or in another country it is lower. And knowing this you have then to incorporate when you are comparing two countries. So this is very important if you are analyzing something in development economics. Maybe you are interested in that. So goods and services, okay. This is, I think, quite clear. We have talked about this. These are material and immaterial goods. And then within a country's borders, this is the so-called national concept. Let me try to sketch this. So this is the Jadebusen. This should be Germany, and here is Wilhelmshaven. And then we take just a fence around our country. And this would be then mean all this is within our country is counted to GDP. Well, this seems quite reasonable, but there is also another reasonable concept. We could also say all German people, what they are producing, this is the overall production in a country. So this would be then, oops, and this is then the so-called gross national product. Well, both are reasonable concepts, but they of course differ because you can then think of there are people living in Germany and maybe just working here in the Netherlands, in the next country. They are traveling every day, just living straight at the border, 10 kilometers, living in Germany and working in the Netherlands means it is not incorporated in GDP, but in GNP. Well, for Germany, it is not that relevant. I will show you in a minute the numbers for this. This is roughly differing only within 1 percentage point. But can you think of countries where it is highly relevant calculating economic performance in GDP or GNP? Somebody an idea? Yeah. So you think of maybe Poland, that from Poland, especially in the health sector and the caring sector, many people are coming. Well, this could be. So it could be a good idea to have a deeper look. To my knowledge, it is not enough that it's really changing, but we shouldn't be surprised that in this country the difference is higher than in Germany. Maybe not only 1%, maybe 3 or 4%. Yeah. Yeah, but why why then? Maybe if you do not have people which really always traveling around, then okay. Okay. Yeah, yeah. This could be possible. Yeah, yeah. But maybe also you are in the right direction. So this then maybe also then can happen, especially in small countries where a relevant number of people are going abroad, maybe only seasonal, but maybe if you think of where a country, a small country, where many people are working or working in this country or the other way around, working abroad. Yeah, which one? I don't hear Switzerland. Not to my knowledge, that they are not. But if you go or to resolve this, you are going also in the right direction. It's a country where you have a large financial sector, and this is Luxembourg. Yeah, you had the idea? Yeah, yeah. You have, I think, roughly 400, 500 inhabitants of Luxembourg, but every day, many people are traveling in because of the financial sector there. So for Luxembourg, the difference is very relevant. And there is also, if you do not look at the people, but if you look at companies which are coming from abroad, there is another example, and this is Ireland. What is the reason that many countries from abroad are coming to Ireland? Do you know this? Yeah. Yes. They make a so-called tax competition. They have the lowest tax rates for companies within the European Union. And this is the reason that all the big tech companies have their European headquarters in Ireland because of low tax rates. The big tech companies have their European headquarters in Ireland. So Apple, Meta, Google, and so on. And for this reason, actually in 2015, the GDP of Ireland increased by more than 20%. And the reason was just that the patents, I think, of Google were transferred because of taxes to the European headquarters. And this is also, this you have also to keep in mind when you are interpreting. So, were the people in 2015 compared to 2014 in Ireland much better off because of an increase of GDP of more than 20%, just because of this shift in a big tech company? Of course not. Very high economic, large economic performance, but you have also to look for the for the reason behind it. Of course. Then the next two ones, specific time period, how much within within which time frame I'm calculating it, and in general, when you are talking what is GDP in one country and it is not further specified, then we talk of the economic performance within 1 year. But in general, we find also the data quarterly. And the last one, sometimes it is missed, final consumption. Because in the end, we want to interpret this number as a welfare indicator. And yeah, since our production processes are very complicated and we have that much intermediate goods, think again about a car. Before we end up with a car as a last product, many other products has to be produced before we have in the end a car. And all these products are of course also sold at private markets in this production process. And this means that only the value added is considered, and this is then the difference between overall production minus all these intermediate goods. And in a minute, I show you how much this intermediate, how large this intermediate sector is. So now we went through all these specific 5 points, and yeah, I think when you are studying economics and quite often then you are talking about economic growth, then you should really know what is the indicator behind this. So then it's a question, we have defined it, how do we calculate it? Well, we have talked quite a lot about producing goods for final consumption. And then, of course, one possibility to calculate overall GDP is just to look at this production process. And this is the so-called production approach. We look at all producing sectors and just adding up this with the market prices. So the value added of all economic sectors. And this is, we are here in the topic of economics. This is then in the end looking at the market, and within the market we are looking at the supply side of the market. Well, but in our definition we have said, well, we want to calculate this with the market prices. And how do we obtain the market prices? Well, we have a supply and a demand, and the intersection of these supply and demand curve is our market equilibrium. So we are selling all our products which we have produced. So we can then, of course, also calculate overall GDP looking from the demand side. We have our income and we are spending our money buying all these goods. So our final uses of goods and services, and this is then demand side of the market, the so-called expenditure approach. And the last one is then, yeah, we ask how we are producing in general. within a macroeconomic view on our economy. And this is the so-called income approach. Maybe I think in microeconomics or your introductory course in business administration. I don't know if you have there also talked about production theory. I think you have already seen something like a production function. That output Y is modeled just as a function where you are feeding in the inputs. So one function, and from a macroeconomic perspective, we do not look at every single input, but on an aggregate scale, then we say the main inputs for producing is just labor and capital. This is inputs, K capital, and L labor. And then, of course, why is it called income approach? With these two main inputs, we are earning our money. So one part is earned by the capital income, and the price, hopefully you have already seen, of capital is in general the interest rate. So capital income would be R times K, where R the interest rate, and the labor income. This is just W times L, and these are our wages. Or on a macroeconomic view, it is the wage level of an economy. Well, and if we carefully add up all these labor incomes and all these capital incomes, this we have within the production process, then in the end, all these incomes in the end have to add up to the same number. And then we ask how much or how large is the proportion within the overall production process in an economy, which is due to capital and which is due to labor. Yeah. These are our theoretical concepts. And then I have already told you, overall, this number for Germany adds up to 4 billion euros. And how can we then go within the production approach, expenditure approach, and income approach? And these are the last numbers in sorry, I'm here in the English course, so it's trillion, of course, because we do not have the Milliarden in English. Sorry. So this is in billion euros, and the overall GDP is then 4.31 trillion euros, which we have done overall. And there you see, if we look at first what is produced in the what has been produced in the last year in Germany, then this adds up to more than 8 trillion euros. And remember, GDP, final consumption. So we have subtract all intermediate goods, and subtracting this adds up to almost half of the overall production. And there, maybe you see how developed, how complicated all our production processes. That the intermediate sector is roughly half of the overall production. So, intermediate sector is roughly 50% of overall production. Well, but then we have to be a little bit careful, because after this we do not end up directly at GDP, but this number is the, oh, this is in German, this should be grow value added, because within this number we have all the tax and subsidies. Remember the circular flow, this we had here. Here we had our tax and subsidies, with the interconnection between the enterprise and government and the household sector and the government, and adding taxes and subtracting the subsidies, then we are ending up at GDP of then roughly the amount of grow value added. If you go to the media, then quite often grow value added and GDP is always taking as more or less the same numbers, but they are not the same numbers. Then going to the expenditure approach, there we are using more or less in a similar way the different sectors as we have done it in a circular flow. So we ask for the private household. So this is private consumption of a little bit more than half of GDP. Then consumption, government consumption and investments have roughly the same level, roughly both 20% maybe. And then of course, this connection with overseas, the inflow of exports, plus, you remember, and the outflow because we are paying for the imports, and the difference here, which we have, is roughly 150 billion euros. And then actually we are ending up directly at GDP. And then coming from below, the income approach, there we start all the compensation of employees. So this is then roughly the wage income. And here we have the capital income. And there we see that the wage income, so the employee side in our economy, is more or less twice as large as the capital income. But then we do not have directly the GDP. This adds up to this so-called national income. Then we have again to add up taxes and import subsidies. This is the so-called net national income. And then comes a highly relevant number, and this I think you also already know, that if you look at a balance sheet of some single company, that of course you have a large part of depreciation. And in order to come to the gross national product now means we have to add up. So the direction is coming from below plus depreciation. And here you see this is almost 20% of overall GDP. So roughly 20% of GDP. Well, we are looking especially here at all persons. So we are in the national approach and we want to come to GDP, and about this number here we have already talked. This is just the difference here between this domestic concept and the national concept. And oops, here you see 150. So this is then, yeah, roughly, I think 2 or 3% of overall GDP. It doesn't count that much for Germany. Okay, and then this is what you maybe do not find that much in textbooks, is that I think it is quite good to know where are we coming from. So if you actually also want to analyze the situation in the countries where you are coming from, then knowing what has happened 10, 20 or 30 years before today would be a good way to analyze the actual situation of your country. And for this, I will now go through all these three approaches: the production approach, expenditure and income approach. And we look where is Germany coming from. So here we start from reunification. And if we look then at now here in this table, we have looked only at the aggregate numbers. Now I look at the main production sectors. And yeah, we have talked from a historical perspective going back 300-400 years. The agricultural sector was in almost all countries the largest production sector, 90% of overall production. And here you see the agricultural sector is now in Germany roughly 1 to 2% of. There you have to be careful. These relative numbers are calculated relative to grow value added. Well, done. Let's have a look at what we call the core of the production in Germany, so that we are a highly industrialized country, that still the manufacturing sector in Germany is roughly 25%. Compared internationally, this is a quite high number. If we go to UK, to France or so, there this number is below 20%. And sometimes, especially after the financial crisis, to have these large manufacturing part of the economy was quite good for us, because then we developed quite well after the turmoil of the financial crisis. But now, if we look at the changes in the energy sector, especially for Germany in the automobile sector, all this, what is happening via digitalization and of course via the upcoming of artificial intelligence. This means that these so-called classical production is coming under pressure. So right now, having this quite high number of 25%, this is not that good for the German economy. If we are going in time back 10, 15 years, then having this high number was quite good for us compared to other ones. But now there are quite a lot of countries which have made a change, a larger change to to the private services, and they now perform a little bit better. So here, if we take together private and public services together, then this number roughly 13% and another one 15%. So together, services have nowadays roughly, what do we, no, this is, where are we? 30, 15, almost 20, sorry. Roughly 50% overall. And what we also see here is the change in time. We are coming from 30, now it is decreasing the part to 30, and in this first 10 years after reunification, we had this change that the service part is still slightly increasing compared to the production part. So what else do we have? Wholesale and trade. Let's say also roughly 20%. And in Germany, quite stable, the construction sector of 5%. And these are maybe some numbers you should keep in mind as the main production sectors in Germany. Well, of course, agricultural sector we can skip because it is not that large anymore. Yeah, let's talk maybe also about this 5% construction sector. If we go back in time to other countries, for example, Spain and Portugal, in the beginning of the 2000s, they had a construction sector with a proportion of 20-25% of overall GDP in these countries. And there we said, well, they are performing very well during this time. And what have we then seen within the financial crisis? The housing bubble has bursted. And then having these large numbers, roughly 2004, 2005, we said, well, production is really increasing in these countries. Very high tax income for the public sector due to this. They are performing good. And 3 years later, this was the reason for the crisis within these countries. So looking at these proportions, more or less you can never say, well, it is good to have it or it is bad. You have always to look at the overall framework where your country is just performing in an economic way. Because also if you go to Spain and then you have seen, well, they are building that much houses, you could then also question, well, who should live in the end there? There are not enough people. And this is also the criticism to GDP. So the best thing what can happen for economic growth is to have an earthquake in your country, because then everything is destroyed, and in the next year you are rebuilding it, and in the next year you have very high economic growth rates. So is it a good thing that you have an earthquake in your country? Of course not. And this is always how to interpret these numbers. Okay, then let's go to the expenditure approach. There we have already almost seen the numbers. Private consumption as the largest part, roughly 55%, and government and investment overall, grow investment, this was roughly 900 billion euros. So this would be then, or let me write it within here, then it is better. So roughly 55%. Government consumption, roughly 20%. And this also roughly 20%. And the difference, roughly 5%. And yeah, later on, when we look at the economic growth rates, I would also recommend that we have a deeper look here to the change of inventories. This happens, of course, also then every year. These are, so to speak, the not sold products which we have produced. They, of course, contribute to GDP. And in 2024, the change of inventories was very low. So almost no contribution to economic growth. But here I gave you the change of inventories over the last 30 years. And then you see that in absolute numbers, you sometimes has here a change of inventories of roughly 50 billion euros. And if you remember, overall GDP, but this number could be plus minus 50 billion euros. And if you remember that GDP is roughly 4 trillion euros, then inventories divided by GDP could be somehow 1% of GDP. So inventories or change of inventories divided by GDP could be up to plus minus 1%. And then you can think of, if nothing else changes in your country, but only the inventories by this number, then this directly means that your economy is growing or decreasing by 1%. And this is a very high number. So if you look at forecasts, it is always a quite good idea to see what is the forecast of inventories, because sometimes there is hidden the number when the people wants to have the growth rate in some neighborhood. Then sometimes they put that the number is in the end 1.5%. Then you find maybe sometimes that inventories change of 0.5. You have a change of inventory of 0.5% relative to GDP. Okay, let's have also a look at the longer time development. Here I have a longer time series starting from the 1970s. And then again, we see here overall roughly private consumption, this 55%, 20%, and 20%. And here, compared to the production side where we had the change between production or manufacturing sector and service sector, here it is quite stable. With one exception that we have here a time period for Germany. In general, we have the situation that exports are much larger than imports, but only within these 10 years. And maybe if you look at the European history, what has happened within these 10 years, especially in Germany, you have an explanation. Is this then a situation where we haven't exported that much? What do you think? From 1990 to 2000. Because this is then a situation where exports are almost equal to imports, since we have a zero here. What has happened? Do you have Friday's lecture? You have no lecture on Fridays? No? Yeah? Okay. Did you had lectures last Friday? Yeah. So what you see here, again, this is the reunification of Germany. Well, and then we saw that we have really to rebuild the eastern part of our country. So this was not a situation where we didn't export less than before. Export actually really also increased, but imports, since we needed that much capital to rebuild the new part of Germany, so imports really yeah, increased much more than exports because of this period of rebuilding the new part of Germany. And this you also see here that investment increased by this part where the part of the difference of exports minus imports decreased. So need for much additional capital to rebuild the eastern part of Germany. So imports increased much more than exports. Well, and if we talk here about this yellow line as x minus im, then we have also to admit that using this representation is actually mathematically forbidden. Because why? Of course, exports minus imports could be also a negative number. That imports are larger than exports. Do you know a country where the import side is much larger than the export side? Pardon? China? No, actually, China is the largest exporter in the world overall. The United States. Well, and this is the reason why this crazy guy arguments that he loves tariffs, because he wants to change this system, these numbers, that relatively exports increase versus imports. He argues that having a negative trade balance is negative, but from an economic perspective, you cannot generally say that our situation, having larger imports, exports than imports, is better than having the other way around. Actually, if you look at the economy of the United States, you can also say, since they have the main currency in the world, we are almost, or the main things in the world are traded within US dollars. So everybody in the world needs US dollar in order to trade. And this then means that this country is in a very, very powerful situation because their money is needed by everybody else, and therefore they can take credit from everybody because we need their money. Well, we see what this guy is doing, and especially you mentioned it, China, if they go on also to pay everything in US dollars. They already started in the Asian part of the world to introduce some special market where the US dollar hasn't anymore this important role. So what this guy is doing from an economic perspective, I would doubt that this is a very good idea because, yeah, he changes the power of the United States. Okay, and the last one, we are quite good in time today, is the income approach. Here we will do it yeah, quite easy, that we calculate just these two parts. And if we have only two parts, the capital income and the labor income, then this of course means that it is enough to just calculate one number because both numbers add together to 100%. And this is the so-called labor share, so the compensation of employees relative, and here again, not relative to GDP, but relative to national income. And studying economics, you just should know that national income, grow value added, and GDP is not the same. If you go in the media, then it is treated more or less as the same in order to describe economic performance. Yeah, and also having a look at the long-term development of this number. There you see it is a little bit more volatile compared to the other numbers, but roughly on average you have here 70%. You have an idea, let's say plus minus 5%. percentage points. Why this number is, yeah, quite volatile. Well, we have here the division between capital income and wage income. Well, the wage income will, of course, not be that volatile. Wages are not differing over 1 year that much. But if you look at the capital markets, look especially at the stock markets, then of course they are quite volatile, and therefore it is not a surprise that you have here a volatile development of this number. So the quite large volatility is due to the volatility of capital markets. Compare especially the stock markets. And you know, stock markets quite fast, they can go up or down 10 percentage points or even more within a year. Yeah, so this in a detailed manner is a deeper look in GDP overall. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, you will see quite a lot numbers in my lecture, because I want you that you really, yeah, know what you are talking about. And if you hear in the media some numbers that you then can really relatively say, well, this is a large number or not that large. And let's go through it. So especially here, the proportions. These are then in the income, it's in the production approach, 5 numbers. Income approach, we have here 4 numbers and the number of the labor share. So roughly 10 numbers. And overall, it would be quite good if you know what is the GDP of Germany, because if you know this number, then if we ask what could be the GDP of the European Union, do you have an idea? If you know that Germany is roughly 4 trillion euros, what would be then roughly the GDP of the European Union? How? What is your idea behind it? That it is 3 times more? Mhm. Okay, great. Yeah. So you just look what are the main part and the main other countries, and 3 is quite good. And overall, if you look especially at the inhabitants of the European Union, then you can say Germany is roughly 1/4 or 1/5. So from the monetary union, it is 1/4, and then a little bit more because especially Poland is also coming as a large country which do not have the euro. But so roughly you can then say Germany is roughly 1/4 of the European monetary or the European Union. So roughly GDP of European Union is around 16 billion euros. So knowing just some number, then you can also quite fast estimate other numbers. Okay, that it was for today. And tomorrow we start then with the so-called magic squares that we again talk about economic growth, but also about other main economic indicators like inflation, employment, and so on. So thank you very much for today, and let's see tomorrow.